Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Andrew Penn. I'm one of the co-founders of Open Nurses. Apologies for our late start here. We're having a few little technical issues on the back end. It is my pleasure this evening to be talking with CJ Spotswood, who is a fellow psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, also goes by the name EntheoNurse, if you've seen that on social media. He's a board-certified psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner with his practice in central Maine. So he's coming to us from all the way the other side of the country from me here in San Francisco. CJ is a third-generation nurse living in Maine with over 20 years of psychiatric nursing experience. And he is also the author of the Microdosing Guidebook, which is published by Ulysses Press. And we'll be sure to put the link for that into the comments of this, the notes for this episode. CJ's undergraduate nursing degree is from one of 15 nursing schools endorsed as a holistic school of nursing with curriculum including yoga, Reiki, and various other complementary and alternative modalities. CJ is a graduate of both the Psychedelics Today Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists program and the California Institute for Integral Studies, or CIIS, Psychedelic-Assisted Therapies and Research Program, CPTR. CJ is also the principal psychiatric clinician for the REMAP Therapeutics, working with psychedelics for individuals with chronic pain. Be interested in hearing more about that tonight. CJ has been researching and teaching on psychedelics since 2018, having presented at the American Psychiatric Nurses APNA National Conference, teaching master classes for Psychedelics Today, Navigating Psychedelics, Clinicians and Therapists Education Program, and their year-long Vital Psychedelics Education Program. He's co-authored Psychedelic Support's 9-hour CME accredited education program entitled Understanding Psilocybin Effects, Neurobiology, and Therapeutic Approaches, and is the author of Psychedelics in Psychiatry, The Nursing Influence and the Future of Psychedelic Therapies, which was just recently published just a few weeks ago in the Journal of the American Psychiatric Nurses Association. So please join me in welcoming CJ Spotswood. Hey, CJ.
Hey, how's it going, Andrew?
Good to see you, man.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
for having
joining
me.
us tonight. Yeah, excellent. We often start off these conversations by just kind of getting oriented to how you got here. Everyone has such interesting, varying paths to getting to this space. So, would love to hear how you found yourself here.
I started out. I've been a psychiatric nurse, as you said, for over 20 years. I actually graduated high school with my LPN, went back for my RN, and kept going back. When I got into the psychedelic space, is I've been working in psych exclusively the entire time, and I had a patient actually come into my ER who was first time psychotic break. He was in his late 50s, no history of drugs, just did not make any sense whatsoever. uh, about 2, 3 days later, after he started coming out of it, started talking to him. We did a full med workup and head CT and talking with the family, and I mean he was completely out of it.
Hmm.
Um, and as when he came out of it, he admitted he had been using the penis envy mushrooms to help treat his depression, and
Oh.
this was 6, 8 months before the pollinization of America and before Michael Pollan's book came out. So I started Google searching what is the penis envy mushroom at work, thinking I'm going to have the computer support people going, "What the heck are you looking up?" Which led me into Stephen Pollock's work on the penis envy mushroom. I started going into like all of his research and going down the Shulgin path. And at that time, I was still in school for my undergrad, so I had full access to basically any research paper I wanted, which has now accumulated to about a 6 foot shelf in my office that I've been saving up all of this old research and um, that's how it kind of started. And then it got much easier when Michael Pollan's book came out and reading it and kind of having all of the reference and knew where I was starting. But so I kind of fell into this psychedelic space. Shortly after that, I ended up having to do a project in grad school about like just compare and contrast like 4 research projects. And since I was already doing all of this on psychedelics, I was like, why not? I
Mhm.
did like 4 old studies and kind of compared and looked at and never thought anything of it. The next semester, I had to do a project where I had to do like an education. I had to talk to peers and do like an hour-long lecture. I ended up doing it on psychedelics and psychiatry and the history of. I threw an abstract in with the APNA National Conference thinking they'll never pick me. Well, they ended up picking me about 6 weeks out. They were like, "Oh, by the way, we're going to put you into the pharmacology track." So it ended up being, 400 or 500 people there, standing room
Mhm.
only. And I didn't tell my school I was going to go and present on this. I didn't know how it was going to go. I went, one of my teachers were there and were like, "We need to talk when you get back." I,
Uh-oh.
yep, that was my thought. I ended up, the rest of the conference, people kept coming up to me and just praising it because it was the first time they had ever had the subject at the conference.
Mhm.
And long story short, I came home and my professor was like, "That was amazing. Can you do your talk for the class?" And the rest
Mm.
of my school, my schooling, my professors were like, "I don't know what you're doing, but it's interesting if you want to keep doing this." So like I had to do it the next semester. I had to like research a type of psychotherapy, and like, "You're doing psychedelic psychotherapy, right?" And I was like, "Okay, I guess I am." And that just led into more and more and more projects. And living here in Maine, I'm kind of isolated from the rest of the world. I didn't know what was going on and who was doing what. So I just was kind of on this island of just doing projects and education and figuring it all out. And somehow, I thought I was committing career suicide, but I wasn't. And here I am, and it's blowing up around me. It's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, you're in the right place at the right time for sure. In fact, I think it might have been that APNA conference in 2020 was first I heard of you. I was like, who's this?
I think
Who's this
so.
person doing from all the way out in Maine doing psychedelic stuff? So that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, that's definitely a national audience there. So you hit on a couple of things that I'm kind of interested in following up on. One was um, that sort of moment of oh, I'm in trouble. That I think I've heard this from a lot of nurses, particularly in parts of the country that are not California or not the Eastern Seaboard, where maybe this is a more kind of common topic. But nurses who are in Tennessee or Texas or
Mhm.
places where they're more apprehensive about that. So I'm just kind of curious to get your thoughts on when people are in a place where this is less sort of common knowledge. If you have any thoughts on what sort of how to traverse that ground.
Yeah. So I ended up realizing when I was actually in CIIS, I was talking with one of my classmates who was sitting next to me one day, and she's a therapist in Chicagoland,
Mhm.
and I was just talking about how this is what I'm doing, and my hospital's kind of allowing me to do this, and she's like, "That must be nice. We can't even do that where I live." And that's when I kind of realized, I'm coming from a place of privilege, and
Mhm.
I kind of feel obligated to change that narrative and make it more normalized and have people feeling more comfortable about it. I mean, there's still times where things come up and I feel like I'm committing career suicide at various times because of putting
Mhm.
myself out there. Like in the chapter of my book, I was kind of tossed up about, do I talk about my own use and self use in here, and I was like, I'm going to do it and see how it goes. And there's been no blowback. I was contemplating, do I even put my name on it at this point? And
Mhm.
and it has been accepted to the point where people are just awesome about it. And I have to admit, though, I am privileged being here in the Northeast, where it's a little more radical. And but I think that the more that we talk about it and the more we come out of that psychedelic closet and normalizing these conversations, the more people will kind of see that. Um, I think now seeing, every time something comes up, like on 60 Minutes, they talk about it. My
Mhm.
inbox is flooded. And, my parents are like, "Oh my God, did you see this? And have you?" My parents are, children of the 60s, and they're just like, "What are you doing right now?" And just amazed by it. But I think it's just that normalizing these conversations are making people feel more comfortable about it, especially with, having credentials and a name behind it, and a
Mhm.
professional background versus someone else who might not.
Yeah, yeah. Where do you see nurses fitting into the psychedelic ecosystem?
I think the better question is, where do I see nurses not fitting in? I mean, when you
Fair.
start thinking about it, I mean, from start to finish, every piece of psychedelia just screams having a nurse in that place.
Hmm.
I really feel like um, a lot of the research that's come out and published, like your own publications, talking about this just comes innate. This is what nurses do. I mean, when you start talking about nurses, if a nurse in an ICU can sit there and hold vigil with someone who's acutely delirious for one reason or another,
Hmm.
it's not a hard stretch to be able to sit with someone where we're inducing that with these substances.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, I want to also encourage people to put questions into the chat, and we will certainly make some time to get to those at the end there. So, you'd mentioned this earlier that, this question of getting pushback from employers or boards, licensing boards, anything like that. And so, if I heard you correctly, that's not something you've encountered.
I absolutely have not. I mean, I have been fortunate enough at this point. So when I was in school and I was writing my book, I was very open about I'm doing this and this is what I'm working on. So when I end up getting hired into my position that I'm at, I have a uh, integrative behavioral health practice within a family practice here in Maine. I'm one
Hmm.
of 10 providers in the practice, the only one doing psychiatry. And my mentor from school, who then ended up becoming my boss, she ended up um, reaching out at one point. She's like, I have a patient who's asking me about microdosing. I don't know anything about it. Can I have you do a one visit consult with this patient and kind of go over it and talk about it? And I was like, okay, I'm definitely open to that. And then a a couple another month later, she's like, hey, I've got another person who's interested. Would you be open to doing it? And I'm like,
Hmm.
it went well, sure. Um, I don't think that my hospital is necessarily. I think it's kind of a don't ask, don't tell policy for them. Like
Hmm.
if you're doing it, great, and it's kind of by word of mouth. But I have providers sending people over to me all the time to talk microdosing or macro dosing or leading this into it.
Hmm.
Um, and in doing so, I've kind of at first like, how do I even broach this subject? How do I even talk about this? How do I put this into a patient's note? And it's
Hmm.
kind of developed into a macro that I have where I'm trying to do that good old CYA piece to it. So in in my
Cover
note, I
cover your ass. Is it? I think we can say that.
yeah, that's what it
It's
is.
our TV show. We can say what we want,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so as I'm trying to cover my ass, my first line I put in the note, the patient came to me to discuss psychedelic medicines.
Hmm.
I'm not inducing it. I'm not doing it. And then I do a little quick blurb about coming from a harm reduction model and meeting the patient where they're at
Hmm.
because I feel, patients are going to do what they're going to do. I might as well. And we have these conversations already with other illegal substances. We have a patient who uses IV opioids. You
Sure.
know, have safe access and test what you've got and needles exchanges, and then I kind of go into why they're looking at doing it, what are some advantages, disadvantages that might be there, risk benefits, and then I kind of look at the next step is what medications are they on and how do we end up potentially having the best outcomes for it, or what might be blocking it, and at that point um, typically they are not my patient, so I kind of give that recommendation back to the whoever's their provider to go, you guys have this conversation.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think what you're saying really underscores a couple of key roles that nurses play that are not necessarily in the job description. One is being an educator.
Mhm.
Um, uh, really, I mean, that's just such a, patient education. I always felt like it got such short shrift, in nursing school. It was like some
Mm.
form that you filled out right before they left the hospital and handed it to them, and then you could chart patient education completed. But really, I mean, what you're talking about is a really dynamic conversation where, they're sharing what they're sharing what they know, and you're able to share what you know.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and then just that collegial being a resource
Yeah.
to our colleagues, and you've become, that's the thing, when you start doing something, you become sort of known for it, you become the go-to guy.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and as I've in my career, like as I've mentioned, just doing this at various conferences that I've been at, people have reached out and go, "Can you talk about this at this conference of how you're doing this?" Because it's just like, and I'm not thinking it's anything different because it's just normal practice to us.
Mhm.
We do this as this education piece,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it's such a radical idea for many people.
yeah, absolutely. And I know you and I have both done a lot of talking at conferences, and invariably I will get approached by nurses afterwards who say, gosh, I would love to do what you're doing, but I could never speak up on a stage. To which I say, I think you could, because I still get scared when I have to get up there. There's that moment of like, I call it the 30 seconds of terror, when you get up there and try and find where your clicker is and your water bottle and all that stuff. And then you get rolling, and sometimes even is fun. Um,
Yeah. Oh, I know the first time I went at the APNA National Conference, like I wasn't thinking it was going to be that large of a crowd. I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. And I'm looking
mhm,
out, at these people literally sitting on the floor in this horseshoe around it.
mhm.
And the only thing I wanted to remember to open up was my daughter was like, make sure you tell everyone I said hello. So I put that
Aw.
right there, and as I get up there to do it, like I'm just looking out and I just go, this is what imposter syndrome feels like. And
Hmm.
that kind of broke the ice a little bit, I felt, but it was kind of like, here I am, I'm an undergrad, I'm still in school, I'm not a, clinician, I'm not a provider,
Mhm.
and I'm going to start talking about these substances that no one has talked about at these conferences, and no one has wanted, like, been able to for years.
Mhm. I mean, I think I know your cat's going to join in on this, which is, I'm surprised my dog isn't trying to speak up right now. Um, Nursing has a reputation for being more conservative than the average
Mm,
medical profession, right? And
yeah,
healthcare profession, and so I think we all have that sort of archetype in our mind of maybe a nursing school professor who was kind of looking over her glasses with her very sensible haircut, and you know um and sort of scolding. Did
yeah.
did you encounter any of that?
Well, I can tell you when I was in school, many moons ago, I still had the instructor that had one of them still wore the nursing cap. I mean, that was,
Wow.
yeah. And the hospital I started at was formerly of ran by the Grey Nuns, so it was very traditional, very. I mean, the hospital had a policy if a patient died, we had to open the windows to let the spirits out, which was fantastic. But that
Hmm.
was the hospital policy that was there. That's still there. Um, so yeah, I mean, I've encountered, in nursing, I've kind of always been, I don't know what to say it, the bad boy where I'm just like, okay, where are the rules? And oh, you didn't say I couldn't do this. So, eh, sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission and kind of going
Hmm.
in that route. But I've been fortunate, I'd have to say, that it hasn't blown up in my face, but yeah, pushing the envelope a little bit more. And sometimes there's that question of, what am I doing here? Where am I going? But it was like in that first conference where I started talking of the research from the 50s and 60s, and looking out, as I'm seeing all of these providers, and nurses, it's the ones that were 60, 70 years old, close to retirement, as I'm talking about, these drugs have been used for years and they've have a huge safety profile. They're going, and I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah, like this is not new. This is
Yeah.
not new news. This is just coming back around.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm sure some people watching this are aware. We just sent out the newsletter, our quarterly newsletter, and one of the pieces in there was that I know you know about this, CJ, because I sent you back her book, but
Yeah.
just went up to Saskatchewan, Canada, to interview Kay Parley, who was a nurse who worked with Humphrey Osmond in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and who is about to be 101 years old in a couple of days. And she's exactly who you're talking about, and
Yeah.
had some amazing stories to tell, which we are working on getting edited into a more. We have 5 hours of recording. She had lots of
Wow.
energy. She's a sprightly 101-year-old.
Oh,
so
God, love her.
so looking forward to sharing that when it's in a usable form. Well, let's talk a little bit about what you're probably most known for in many ways, which is your book and
Yeah.
microdosing. Here it is, beautiful cover.
Thank you.
Um, Tell us about how'd you get interested in microdosing?
Once again, I kind of fell into it. So I ended up doing a conference shortly around the time I did the APNA conference. I had done the Mount Tam psilocybin conference.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and after I had done that, Daniel reached out. He's like, "Hey, I've got someone who's looking at wanting to do a microdosing course. She's got some questions. Would you be willing to?" So I reached out. Her name's Tara Lee, and she's like, "I'm putting together. I'm doing microdose coaching. I'm a microdosing coach." She's like, "I'm getting bombarded with questions on like drug on drug interactions. Can someone with this medical condition do this?" And she's like, "I am over my head and I can't answer these. Would you be willing to kind
Mm-hmm.
of jump in on this?" And my initial answer was, I thought about it and I was like, I'm interested in this, I'm about this, but everything at that point I'd read about microdosing is completely placebo affected, and this was 4 years ago or so. So I was like, give me a couple weeks to kind of really dig into the research a little bit because I'm not going to back something I don't believe in. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so then I ended up going into that, into my archives of all the research from the 50s and 60s and kind of found we were doing placebo research in some of this original stuff. Like we were looking at, but it was used as a placebo. And what we found was like this minimum dose, the threshold dose,
Mm-hmm.
and but what do we do with it? So that led me into Jim Fadiman's work and going deep into that. And I really was like, there is something here that we just don't know. I don't think we're asking the right questions at this point.
Mm.
Um,
What do you think the
so
right
I,
questions are?
I don't know if we can measure them at this point yet,
Mm.
especially under the current legal landscape of doing this.
Okay.
That's the huge part of this, I feel. Um, but I'll touch on that in a second. Like, so she had asked me about doing it, and I was like, so I think we had 10 people in the course, and to kind of save the time of doing it, I was like, I started putting together this quick handbook. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm going to be talking to people, I want to kind of go over what is this, but why am I going to waste your time, this basic stuff, when I can send this information out to you?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I started working on it, which turned into a 20-page document, into a 40-page document, um, and like when I sent it out in the first meeting, I said to everyone, I am not your provider.
Mm-hmm.
Mind you, I'm not graduated yet either. I'm not giving you medical advice, but if you bring this handbook, print it off, bring it to your provider, and share this
Mm-hmm.
information, all this information is available for them to go research of where I'm getting this information. And that's when that proverbial light bulb blew over my head, and I was like, I'm onto something here. This is bigger than what I'm doing. Like if I had a patient coming into me, this is what I'd want them to bring to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I started looking for publishers and kind of running this around. I ended up reaching out to Jim Fadiman to get his blessing because I didn't want to do anything that he didn't. I'm using a lot of his work and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and which actually, a little funny story. When I end up reaching out to Jim, Jim's like, he's like, I've got some. I'll take a look at it and see what I think, And he emailed me. I think it was like 2 days later, and he's like, I haven't read it all yet. I love what you're doing. This is kind of the book I put out. He goes, I have one complaint. Okay, Jim, what is your complaint? He goes, where you say, microdosing is 1/20th to 1/10, and, with LSD being, 10 to 20 mics. He goes, what I find is more 7 to 13 micrograms. He goes, I know there's some people out there that'll kind of go against that, but this is based on my tens of thousands of research that I've collected over the years. And I'm like, Jim, can I just quote you on that? He goes, oh, absolutely, please do. Done.
I want to know how people are measuring a 5 microgram variance of LSD.
I bet you Bryce could probably figure that out up in Vancouver.
Yes. Bryce, we're going to try and get Bryce Koch on this in the next few months. He does
Oh,
some
that'd be great.
interesting work up there, in Vancouver. Yeah. So the thing that fascinates me about microdosing is, I mean, lots of things, right? It's
Yeah.
so seems very incredibly popular right now. I can't sort of go anywhere without somebody telling me about their microdosing. And what I'm also finding is that there's a lot of variance in what people consider microdosing.
Yeah.
And a lot of different ways that people will engage in it. So, with the clear header, we're not engaging in medical advice here. We are NPs, but we are not your NP. So I hear everything from like, doing a Fadiman style thing of 1/10 of a dose every 4 days to like, I just take a quarter tab of LSD when I'm at a party. And it's all being called microdosing. So
Yeah.
there seems to be a lot of variance in that. But the question I wanted to ask you is that, so the interesting thing is if you sort of look at what, you're very familiar with the data, and you talk about this in your book, that there's been a number of studies that have attempted to kind of control for expectancy effects, through self-blinding or,
Yep.
active blinding, and that it hasn't really in those studies separated out from placebo. Yet people swear by it. And so I'm trying to kind of square the scientist in me is like, okay, so the data says this is expectancy effects. That's fine. We see the expectancy effects in every drug group, right? So why would microdoses be any different? But then on the other hand, people really, feel very strongly about the effects that they get from it. So I just would love for you to kind of talk about that tension.
So I think that the bigger question is kind of the chapter I left out of my book at the last minute, because with my ADHD, I go down rabbit holes sometimes, and sometimes those rabbit holes work great. Sometimes it's just personal growth, and one of those rabbit holes I went down was Irving Kirsch's work, which
Placebo.
the placebo effect,
Yep.
and the standard, SSRI research that's out there. And when I read this, what blew my mind on it was, why the hell did I never hear about this in school? Like, so like kind of the cliff notes of Irving Kirsch's work is, we look at the standard research out there saying that SSRIs, and I don't know the exact number, 73% effective for depression. The more depressed have better effects. Well, what Kirsch and his team did was they went back in Freedom of Information Act, all of the research, the studies that were done, and got the dropout rates, got all the numbers for I don't know, hundreds of SSRI research that was out there. And when you start adding in all the dropout rates and non-completion, the research that he found was it was around 33% effective for SSRIs, which aligns with microdosing, ironically enough. And the other part of that I found out that I kind of found was interesting and I never thought about was to be able to have a SSRI medication. And sorry if I'm blowing the magic of antidepressants out for everyone. I'm really not anti-med. I prescribe them literally every day, and I believe in them. But what they also mention is to be able to get FDA approval, you have to have 2 clinical trials showing that is more effective than placebo. You can run that study 100 times and it's costly. 2 times is all that matters. So, when someone is arguing, that microdosing is a placebo effect, okay, what is standard medication How much of what we're doing when we're prescribing medication is that belief that we're selling to the patient that this is going to work?
Mhm,
How
mhm.
much of it? How many times have I mean, you yourself? You talk to a patient a week later that after you started an antidepressant, I feel so much better. Everything is so much
Mhm,
better, and everything else. We both
mhm.
know, that's not an adequate amount of time for it to become effective, but
Right.
it's working. So
Yeah.
really, I suspect I kind of suspend that disbelief a little bit and kind of I'm okay with answering of I don't care why it's working or needing to know how it's working exactly.
Mhm,
The Machiavellian, the ends justify the means in my practice, and I hate
mhm.
that that's kind of avoiding the question of microdosing effect. But you're starting to see a lot more research being done on expectation bias with standard medication.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it
Yeah.
was also interesting with Kirsch's work when it came out. After that, it caused such a stir within the community. The federal government has never paid for any head-to-head clinical trials for antidepressant medication since.
Right.
It's all being done by the private companies.
Yeah, and they rarely actually take on those studies. I mean, the STAR-D
Yeah,
study, which is now, 20 years old,
right.
was one of the last major studies where there was actually head-to-head comparison of antidepressants. So, yeah, whenever I hear somebody say, "Well, this antidepressant is better than this one," I say, "Based on what?" Because show me the head-to-head trial. They often just don't exist. So, so let's get into that because I mean, I think one of the things that maybe I'm kind of a cranky old man, so I've been known to get curmudgeonly about this sort of stuff, and um, uh, and I'm also a clinician, and so similarly, I prescribe things that may have kind of marginal chemical effects, but seem to have significant clinical effects, and so struggling with that sort of tension. But what I see, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. There's a paper I want to write sometimes called "Microdosing is a Placebo and Why That's Okay." Um, because I don't think people appreciate the power of the placebo effect.
No.
And that we think about placebos as like you're a fool, you got duped, right? You believed in the phony pill rather than the real one. And I don't see it that way. I see it as like it's this complex phenomenon that is essentially a function of hope, that people expect they're going to get better. They hope they're going to get better. They're actively engaged in. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me about microdosing is that it's fussy. You've got to you can't just go down to Walgreens and get a pack of microdoses. Like you got to source a Schedule 1 drug, and then you've got to divvy it up into these tiny little doses, or you've got to grow your own mushrooms. There's a lot of work involved in it. And I suspect the more that you have to do, like the stronger the expectancy effects become. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there was another study that Kirsch quoted upon, and like I said, I went deep study. I ended up started reading some dissertations, and there was one dissertation where they cited a study from the early '60s, and it's a study that we will never be able to do again. And what was interesting, there was four arms in this where they end up giving people, and it was within a state hospital. They gave them either an actual placebo, a real sugar pill, nothing there. They gave them methylphenidate and said, this is going to help you feel better.
Hmm.
They gave people methylphenidate. They gave people um, nothing and didn't tell them they were getting anything, and saw what what their improvement was. And then they ended up dosing people with methylphenidate without telling them and putting it in their orange juice.
Hmm.
And
Methylphenidate
the,
is Ritalin for those who are not familiar. Yeah.
Yep. And what they found was the people that knew that they were getting something and it might help had great effect. The people, and there's a whole mathematical to figure out, like taking out you know, the number of people that didn't do well in comparison to get these true numbers. But the people that got the methylphenidate in the orange juice that didn't know, they felt like shit, heart
Hmm.
racing, anxious, feeling horrible.
Hmm.
What's the difference between the two? People thought they were going to start feeling better versus I'm just drinking orange juice and now I feel horrible.
Right. Right. It reminds me of that one study. the gentleman's name, I can't remember. He's got a Hungarian name, starts with an S. Did, which was really interesting with microdosing. And so, if I'm remembering, the take home was that if you thought you were taking a microdose, you reported a benefit, even if it was actually a placebo. And if you were taking what you thought was a placebo that was actually a microdose, you didn't report any benefit. So, kind of similar to what you're describing, the
Yeah.
methylphenidate in the orange. So it's what you expect that really, you kind of get what you expect.
Yeah, well, the part that's always interesting to me is because, as I've been doing this more, people will come up to me and, of course, here's my microdosing experience.
Oh, I'm sure you get a lot of stories. Yeah.
Oh, my favorite is I get people coming up to me and they hear, oh, you know about microdosing. Have you heard of this book? And they recommend my book to me. That's a fun one.
You know the term mansplaining?
Yeah.
So that came from Rebecca Solnit.
Yep.
And the story was that she was at some gathering talking about, she was listening to a guy talk about a book that then he went on to explain this book to her, and she says, "Yes, I know, I wrote it."
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, but I'll never forget my first like public appearance in my book, and I'm at a fungi fest, and this woman comes up to me, and she was telling me she was in her mid to late 60s, I want to say. Her husband was too. He had suffered a right-sided stroke, so he lost use of his left side. Did the standard treatment, working with PT and neurology, doing everything. They had said basically, if you don't have any improvement within a year with standard treatment, all the improvement that you make is going to probably be as far as you're going to get.
Yeah.
So at the end of the year, they kind of said, screw it, we have nothing to lose. They end up going in, and I don't think they went to Walgreens, but they did obtain chocolate, magic mushroom chocolates. And when they did, he started microdosing. He also had vascular dementia.
Mm-hmm.
So, standard treatment with that is also SSRI, so you don't get more anxious and more upset and having more problems. Well, he ended up having improvements within 2 weeks, 3 weeks. He ended up regaining the entire use of his left side of his body and was
Mm-hmm.
walking again within a month of starting microdosing. It could be the fact that, that 13th month of treatment made a difference.
Sure. Natural course
But
of
to
the illness.
her,
Yeah.
I mean, to her crying on my shoulder and thanking me for what I do, I'm okay with not knowing. I'm okay with suspending what am I doing here into the woo-woo aspect of it and not knowing. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I mean, maybe in a way, in this very secular modern society we live in, that, you're kind of creating a funnel for hope.
Yeah.
You're creating a way that people can actively kind of live out their hope through this ritual. Now, I guess the one thing,
that's gonna be a new title I'm putting on my CV right there is I have
ritual,
a tunnel of hope. A tunnel of hope.
you're a tunnel of
A funnel
a
of hope.
funnel of hope. CJ, it's almost as good as EntheoNurse, not
It
quite as
is.
good,
But not
but
smooth.
so so this part of me, sorry, cranky Andrew's back, but so part of me says, well, look, what's the harm in it? Okay, fine, you want to nibble on your LSD this way, go for it, but then talking to people like Helen Thomas and the folks at the Roth Lab, this concern about chronic serotonin 2B stimulation. So for those of you who aren't neuroscience geeks like me and CJ, you take LSD or psilocybin, you stimulate a bunch of receptors, largely serotonin receptors. Serotonin 2A is kind of the classic thing that you have to tickle in order to get a psychedelic effect. But there's 13 other serotonin receptors, and the serotonin 2B, turns out if you tickle that chronically, it can cause your heart valves to grow, something called valvular heart disease, which we found out from a drug called fen-phen way back in the day, right? So the diet drug. And this question of taking a drug that is normally taken maybe once or twice a year, like LSD, and taking it, maybe 100 times in the course of a year or something like that, that may result in this negative outcome. I'm wondering about your thoughts on it.
I don't want to dismiss it. I respect Kalen, and I've had conversations with him on this. Um,
Mhm,
I feel, it is not exactly apples and oranges, but there was a lot of people in the 60s going on tour and eating a lot of acid for a long period of time and
mhm,
not having this as problems. Um, this is all based on hypothetical from other drugs like the
mhm,
fen-phen, and there's two chronic migraine medications that had
mhm,
that same two that were going on. But the popularity that we're seeing of microdosing and the amount of people that are not, you know, reporting what they're doing, but they're doing it. We're not seeing this yet. Is there a
right,
possibility? I don't want to say that there's not, but you know, the possibility of the side effects from a lot of medications are out
mhm,
there. And if you catch it early, if you see it, it can be, as long as the damage isn't continue and it can be caught with an echocardiogram and things like that, like, it's not completely reversible. It's or completely unreversible. So I think, as we start scaling things up, we're going to start seeing some of that. And that goes back to the problem with, as things are as Schedule 1 and illegal, we can't track these types of things. And I think it'd be nice to see if some of this research that's going on, people were starting to like add this in, just kind of a side note going, hey, we're doing this.
mhm.
Let's kind of see if there is any.
Yeah,
I
so to see
I
some
don't know.
prospective studies,
Yeah.
if we could get 1,000 people that are about to start microdosing to get pre and post echoes after a year of this or something, would that might be useful. I know there is talk in the FDA, because I'm involved in drug trials, that the FDA is starting to want to consider wanting to monitor um, heart heart valve thickness as part of their safety monitoring for these, because their question that they're wondering is, because it's looking like the sort of the one and done model is probably a little optimistic. The idea that
Mhm.
somebody's going to have one dose of psilocybin and never have depression again for the rest of their life,
Yeah.
which would be great. We heard that in the early days of the Hopkins trials and things like that. But, probably more likely it's going to be something that we have to repeat maybe once or twice a year or something like that. And I think they're interested from a safety standpoint of like,
Mhm.
what happens if somebody needs to get this treatment 25 times? I think I could
Yep.
introduce them to plenty of people that have taken psilocybin 25 times and they can measure their heart valves. But,
Yeah.
I'm not running the FDA.
Well, I think the other part of that to kind of take into consideration, we and I didn't premise this conversation today like I usually do. I come from this medical model. I am a medical provider. I have
Mhm.
all of that. But I don't believe that these substances should be completely done in the medical model. I
Mhm.
believe that, and we're never going to get rid of the underground. I mean, that's
No,
just something that's going to happen. We see and I don't want to like the cost of the using it in Oregon and stuff. It's great that there's access, but many people don't have access to that,
that's
you
right.
know? So, if someone's going to go spend, I don't know what the cost is, let's say $30 for a bag of mushrooms
Mhm.
as opposed to 25, $3,000, there's a big difference. And I think of the other piece of that. One of my friends at CIIS, I was talking to her, like she was depressed, same story of many people.
Mhm.
Nurse depressed, COVID, lockdown,
Mm.
needed to get her start back on an SSRI. I don't remember, sertraline, fluoxetine, whatever it was. Knew the dose, knew what she was on before, but because she didn't have a provider at that time, no one would prescribe it. She couldn't find a prescriber to do anything during COVID. So she was able to go out, purchase some spore syringes. They accidentally fell onto a bag of rice or something else. They accidentally grew. She ingested them and had microdosing and had better outcomes than she did with the SSRIs by microdosing.
If I
That's
was
a
that
huge
if I
outcome.
was that nurse's, floor manager, I'd be concerned about her clumsiness.
You know, I think she was in a point where I think she was in a like she wasn't doing too much of hands-on like clumsiness type. It might have been paperwork and not needles.
Well, I mean, you're bringing up an interesting point, right? Because I think, I think when we get, when and if MDMA gets FDA approval, I'm hearing price tags anywhere between $20,000 to $35,000 for 3 doses, and I think a lot of people are going to be flabbergasted by that. But the reality is, a lot of that is labor cost,
Yeah.
right? So if we're going to replicate what we did in the MAP study, we're looking at 50 hours of therapy times 2 therapists. Well, that's 20,000 right there if you pay them $200 an hour, which in the Bay Area is a cheap rate, right? So it's kind of like people, go on about big pharma, but like, what about big therapy, right?
Mhm.
Like, what about the cost of that? But what you're describing is really kind of essentially a self-help model.
Mhm.
It's like you're not doing this with a therapist. You're buying a bag of mushrooms or growing a bag of mushrooms and doing this on your own. I mean, for people that are wanting to do that, I mean, what sort of things should they be thinking about? Not medical advice, of course, but like what sort of what's going to help keep them safer from a harm reduction standpoint?
Safe setting, knowing where you are, what are you doing? Are you in a safe location? I think of it kind of like hiking. If you're going to go out and solo hike and backpack,
Mm-hmm.
there's some dangers involved. You might break your leg. What
Mm-hmm.
do? You tell people where you're going to go, you tell people where you're going to be back, and if I'm
Mm-hmm.
not back, here's where, come looking for me if there's something that's going south, etc. I can, I have a friend who one of his best journeys was paddling his boat over to an island nearby and eating some mushrooms, walking the hiking trail on that island for 5 miles in and out, getting to the other end, coming up with a new name for his practice and what he's going to do, and walking back and integrating it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's going to be. I think having that safe setting, um, starting low, going slow. I wouldn't expect someone to, you know, eat a giant amount and go out and being in public or an unsafe. I mean, I've got a friend that was actually my microdosing course, and she was telling me, I'm looking forward to my birthday. I'm going to the Boston Museum of Art. I'm going to pop in my iPods. I'm going to listen to Beethoven. I'm going to eat 2.5 tabs of acid and spend my day. I don't recommend that for someone who's going to be the first time doing it, but someone that knows that space and feels comfortable, that could
Mm-hmm.
probably be one hell of a day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For somebody who has been in that pool before,
Yep.
yeah, you don't want that to be your first swim.
No.
I mean,
Oh God, no.
one of the things I really liked about your book is that you have these sort of practices in the back for integration and intention setting, and I kind of feel like those are things that get a lot of lip service. People talk about them all the time, but like, give us some pragmatic tips. Like, what's something that somebody who's involved, wants to integrate an experience or wants to set an intention that's a little more granular.
Well, I since you mentioned it, my book is broken up into three parts. The first part is for like the 101, like literally giving it to my parents. They know nothing about it. Here's how to go about it. Part two is for the medical provider that the patient can come in and say, I'm looking at doing this. Here's kind of the information for you. And it's written to a little bit of a higher level with resources and cited a little bit more. The last part is the workbook part, which is like a 6-week with different very punny names for each of the weeks. But it really comes from that biopsychosocial model and where am I in the world? What are these things that are important for me? Where is my connection with others? What are some things I can do to improve myself, etc. And I think that that could be used for patients when they're starting an antidepressant or just regular therapy, not necessarily microdosing. It really looks at what is my place in the world and where do I want to go and how do I get
Mhm.
there. So it's kind
Mhm.
of like it's almost like a psychotherapy light, just to kind of get you stimulated with some of these questions.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. Yeah,
really,
why
it's
why are
like,
you doing this, right? What
right.
Yeah.
What do you want to gain? Who is a friend that you haven't talked to in a while? How could you reach out to them? What would you end up saying? You don't need to, but what do you want to get off of your chest? What is something you've
Mhm.
wanted to do for a length of time and haven't for whatever reason? why not push yourself and try to go do that? You know, really just kind of looking at and answering the questions to stimulate the conversation. Sometimes that people just go, if they're depressed or whatever, they don't want to or can't do it, or they don't even think about it because they're just holding on to survive.
Yeah. So really inviting that kind of deep reflection
Yeah.
before one begins this process um, would have have a significant bearing on the outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the sort of things that I think you're getting asked, I can imagine will increasingly be asked by other nurses, being asked of other nurses. I mean, I think about during, the vaccine rollout, for example,
Mm.
how many questions did you get from friends and family members, about should I do this? When's a good time? Is this an okay, can I get this and a flu shot at the same time?
Yep.
Like we are a trusted source of information that is, it's interesting because we're held in regard, but we don't seem to have that same intimidating air that sometimes, people place on other of our colleagues,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
you
I
know?
mean, but everyone knows a nurse. People might know one doctor or one specialist, but you say, "Hey, do you know a nurse?" I know 10 of them, and here's where they're at. I know a whole family of them.
Yeah.
That's the way it is. Everyone knows a nurse.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of great comments in the
Yeah.
chat here, but there's also some questions here, and like let me drop this one into here. So I know you've been involved in different kinds of training. I'm sorry, we're kind of hiding behind the banner here. Do you feel like nurses need an advanced degree to work in this area? And yeah, what sort of training do you think that nurses should get? Is there any specific nursing specific training, or are these general programs sufficient? What are
Oh,
your thoughts on that?
well, not to plug my own training program I have on my website that's accredited, but EntheoNurse.com. But I think it's relevant to kind of get an idea and kind of know things and kind of like I think when it comes to with psychedelics specifically, um, I think of it this way. I think that having an experience is important. I that's one hill I'm going to go on because I think you can learn all you want from a book, but when you go out, if I wanted to go hunting hunting, do I want to go with a Maine guide who has read every book in the world or they've been out on the trail? I'd much rather be out there with someone who's been around animals and has camped before and kind of know a little bit, um, knowing that space, because then you can kind of be there with the person a little bit to kind of help them and this and that. I think when it comes to um, the training, there's so many different schools, and we're going to see more popping up. We know that's going to happen, and I'm fortunate enough. I've been in different programs. I teach for different programs, and they all have their benefits. They all have um, their drawbacks. And right now, until we kind of get a formalized expectation, I'm trying the brain was it brainwaves that came out with um, the proposed training guidelines and what should be expected. I think that people are just kind of trying to guess where are we going to fit in here with it. Um, and I think that having something just to kind of get an idea of what are these substances, what it makes them different, what can they do, because you're at this point you're not going to learn them in basic nursing school. As you know, we're hoping that that's going to be the case. So you've been a part of those conversations, but they're not going to be there. So you need to learn from somewhere, even if it's through lineage of indigenous use, things like that. There's still learning in that sense as well. Um, but I think that the education is going to be important for the difference for the nursing education is going to be what is the role that the nurse is going to be. I think that being there as a sitter, being present, being authentically there, that's kind of a no-brainer. I think that no-brainer for nurses because we already do that.
Hmm.
But when it starts coming into, being the person that's responsible, being the primary person, I think that, having the advanced degree is kind of important to, having someone being a doctor, a therapist, or having some higher level of education that's somewhere present in case something goes south in this medical model.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We put. I actually worked on those. Brain Futures, I think, was the
Yep.
organization that you're thinking of that wrote. We wrote professional practice guidelines in conjunction with the American Psychedelic Practitioners Association, and so that link is in the chat there. But it speaks to a lot of what you talked about there. Well, CJ, this is fantastic. You said EntheoNurse is we've got your website here. Let's get that
Yep.
up on the screen. So this is the best way for people to reach you.
Yep.
Should they, and your book, just to, we'll put this in the comments here, but the Microdosing Guidebook, highly
Which
recommended.
actually is now on Maps. I just got an email the other day. It's now on the Maps bookstore. I've been working on it for over a year to get it there.
Congratulations. How
Thank
many
you.
copies of this is floating around in the world? Do you know?
I have no idea the number. I get the numbers once a year. There's a couple thousand that's out there. I do know I've gotten people that have sent me pictures of. I've seen this in New York City,
Yeah.
North Carolina, Colorado. Someone sent me a picture. They saw it on a shelf in Norway, Canada. I mean, it's amazing to see that. So if anyone sees it out there in the wild, send me a picture of it where you found it. I love getting those. I love walking into a bookstore and seeing it there, and I'll go over and I'll sign it and just leave it there and go. It's a lot of fun.
That's great. Yeah, I think I sent you the picture of the place in New York.
Yep.
And I'm going to mispronounce it, but the Anetheum, I think it's called.
Yeah, I'm hoping to go there in a couple weeks.
It's a great spot. It's
Yeah.
definitely a really cool space for psychedelic social events in New York City and Manhattan.
Yeah, only one person's ever come over and go, "Is that really your book? Prove me and show your license." So I think if anyone walks into any bookstore and just says, "The hell with it, I'm going to sign this book," no one's going to say anything. I'm not saying to go do that, but you could.
I'm going to start calling myself Michael Pollan. No, I probably
Right?
shouldn't do that.
Shouldn't do that one.
I think people know what he looks like, and he's much
Yep.
taller than me. So I have better hair, though.
You do.
Well, CJ, thank you for spending some of your time with us tonight. I know it's getting late out there in Maine.
Yeah.
And so thank you for everyone who's tuned in here today and those who will watch it on the replay. Look forward to seeing you next week. One little housekeeping thing. We have just launched, Open Nurses has launched a survey, which we're asking the folks that are interested in this work to fill out, which will help us do a better job of sort of directing these kind of public offerings and also looking for ways that we can expand what we do, because we're just a little group of 3 folks that runs things behind the scenes. So if you get the Open Nurses newsletter, which just went out yesterday, there's a link directly to that, and we'll link to it here in the show notes on YouTube. So if you can take a few minutes and fill that out, it'll definitely help us create a better organization that if you're interested in being involved in, you can certainly let us know there as well. So thanks for tuning in, CJ. Thanks for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it and appreciate the good work you're doing.
If people can leave a review on Amazon for the book, that's awesome. Any small bookstore support small business, they can get it in because Simon Schuster's carrying it. So if you go to a small bookstore, they can get it, and chances are they'll get a few in because I'm not the great at publicizing it. And I've had a few people ask me if there's an audiobook. There's not, but I bet you if you were to get a hold of Ulysses Press and ask them enough, we could probably get that done. So I appreciate anything that, getting the word out there. I love it. So thank you.
Maybe you could read it in like a Dennis McKenna voice.
Ooh.
The Microdosing Handbook. All right. On that note,
AI can do that. That'd be great.
Right. All right, everyone. Thanks for spending time with us. We'll see you next month. All right. Bye, CJ.
Bye, Andrew.